This map shows the state of the American South in late 1780. Note Charleston at the bottom of the frame. Its capture that May resulted in over 5,000 Continental soldiers taken prisoner, the single greatest American defeat of the war. Exploiting this collapse was a British officer named Banastre Tarleton. He led an elite, fast-moving force of cavalry and infantry that had spent months terrorizing the countryside and crushing local resistance with clinical efficiency. To counter him, General George Washington sent Daniel Morgan. Morgan was a former teamster with no formal military education and a deep hatred for the British. He arrived to find a starving, poorly equipped remnant of an army that barely numbered 600 regulars. By this point, the American cause in the South was effectively vanishing. They weren't just losing territory, they were facing a professional military machine that their current forces were physically incapable of stopping in a direct fight. The most significant problem was the composition of Morgan's ranks. Half of his men were militia, untrained civilians who had a reputation for panicking and fleeing the moment they saw a British bayonet charge. Standard 18th century doctrine required armies to behave like two solid blocks, trading volleys at close range. But when applied to militia, the result was a disaster. At Camden, American militia saw the British advancing and instantly broke, leaving the army to be slaughtered. Knowing this, Morgan made a choice that his own officers found terrifying. He stopped at a cattle pasture called the Cowpens and positioned his men with a broad, uncrossable river directly at their backs. He took an army notorious for running away and placed them on open ground with no route of escape. He deliberately created a situation where his men had to either hold their ground or drown. Morgan's plan relied on a blunt assessment of human psychology. He understood that his militia weren't cowards. They simply lacked the training to stand in a line and trade fire with professionals. He stopped trying to make them act like regulars and started planning for their limitations. The night before the battle, Morgan visited every campfire to explain a very specific contract. He told the militia they wouldn't have to face a charge. He asked them for only 2 well-aimed shots and promised that once they fired, they had his permission to leave the field with honor. Morgan built a 3-line defense. First, a thin screen of sharpshooters to pick off British officers. Next, the main militia line. Behind them, his disciplined Continentals, hidden by a low rise. Finally, entirely out of sight behind a second hill, his hidden cavalry. Morgan had turned the standard tactical model on its head. He didn't try to prevent a retreat. He made a planned, orderly withdrawal the primary engine of his entire trap. When Tarleton arrived at dawn, he saw exactly what he expected, a trapped, inferior American force. He didn't wait for his men to eat or rest. He immediately ordered a full-speed frontal assault across the frozen pasture. As the British advanced, Morgan's first line did their job. Sharpshooters picked off the British captains and sergeants, creating an immediate gap in leadership before melting back into the second line. The British hit the main militia line next. The Americans held long enough to fire 2 devastating volleys, cutting down rows of redcoats and filling the field with thick, gray smoke. The militia followed instructions. They turned and funneled cleanly around the sides of the hidden Continentals. Tarleton saw them leaving and assumed it was a rout. His troops broke formation, dissolving into a disorganized mob sprinting uphill to finish a fleeing enemy. The disorganized British ran straight into the Continental line's point-blank volley and bayonet charge. Simultaneously, the hidden cavalry smashed into their right, while the returning militia reappeared on their left. The trap shut. A textbook double envelopment, executed by farmers and shopkeepers. Morgan exploited Tarleton's own arrogance. He used the British commander's assumptions about American weakness to pull him into a kill zone that Tarleton didn't even recognize until his entire command had been destroyed. The battle lasted barely an hour. In that time, Morgan annihilated a quarter of the British light troops in the South. Tarleton lost over 80% of his command, while Morgan suffered only 12 deaths. When the news reached the British commander, Lord Cornwallis, he flew into a rage. He ordered his army to burn their own supply wagons, desperate to lighten his load and chase the Americans north to seek revenge. This map illustrates the fatal result of that chase. Cornwallis pushed his men hundreds of miles away from his supply bases in South Carolina, exhausting his troops and overextending his lines. This frantic pursuit eventually forced him to the coast at Yorktown, where he would be trapped and forced to surrender. Military historians still study Cowpens because it demonstrates that victory doesn't require a flawless army. It requires a commander who understands the psychological reality of his troops. Daniel Morgan won because he refused to fight the battle the British expected. He accepted his army's greatest vulnerability and turned it into the very weapon that broke the British hold on the South.